Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session today. It would be great if you could introduce yourself in the chat so that we know who we have with us for this session. My name is Mai Skovgaard, and I'm a specialist with INASP, and I was the project manager of the Transforming Employability for Social Change in East Africa project, which we will be sharing learning and insights from in this session. And because the title of the project is fairly long, we tend to just shorten it to the acronym and call it TESIA. So if you hear us referring to TESIA throughout this session, we're talking about the project that we've been working on together. In this session, we'll be exploring how an ecosystem approach can transform teaching and learning through partnerships that bring universities into conversation with social entrepreneurs, businesses, policymakers, and their communities in order to ensure that students acquire the skills that they need as future professionals. And the way we will run this conversation, this session will be as a conversation between me and some of my colleagues from the TESIA project, who you can see on the screen, and I will be introducing them later on. And at the end of the session, we'll open up for questions or comments from the audience. If you want to type any of those as we go through the session, you're welcome to do that in the chat, and then we can pick them up at the end of the session. Before I introduce the TESIA project and our ecosystem approach, along with the panelists we have with us today, we have a couple of questions that we would like to ask you. So we're going to share a link to Mentimeter with you in the chat, along with a code. So if you could follow that link and answer those two questions that we have on Mentimeter, we will then show you the results of those questions a bit later on. So I'm just going to leave the Mentimeter slide up for a bit so that you can see the link and the code. You can type your answers as I introduce the TESIA partnership and our ecosystem approach. So feel free to do that while I talk. Could we pull up the first slide, please, Tabitha? So when we started TESIA, we started from a challenge that we identified together as a partnership. And this challenge was that many graduates in East Africa can be ill-prepared to address the challenges they encounter in the workplace, or ill-prepared to leverage their skills and ideas to meet social needs. In order to meet this challenge, we designed the Transforming Employability for Social Change in East Africa project. And we designed this project to meet the challenge by supporting universities, industries, communities, and government to work together to create an improved learning experience for students. And the purpose of this improved learning experience was to foster critical thinking and problem-solving skills, and allow for practical learning beyond the classroom in order to improve graduate employability. As opportunities to progress and succeed in higher education can be very unequal, we deliberately put gender-responsive pedagogy at the heart of TESIA. And we did this by asking how classrooms and campuses can be made more inclusive, and by working with lecturers to make their teaching gender responsive in order to ensure that both women and men are able to participate, thrive, and learn through their studies and in subsequent employment. Could we have the next slide, please, Tabitha? So when we were designing the TESIA project, we realized early on that in order to address the challenge we'd identified of graduates in East Africa often being ill-prepared for the world of work, we would need to collaborate with a variety of partners and stakeholders, both inside and outside academia. And we also knew that we would need to find innovative ways of bringing these partners and stakeholders into the project. We therefore deliberately designed the TESIA partnership to include a variety of organizations. So we were working with 4 universities, 2 in Tanzania and 2 in Uganda, and these were Mzumbe University and the University of Dodoma in Tanzania, and Gulu University and Uganda Martyrs University in Uganda. And the project was implemented in these 4 universities. In addition to the 4 universities, we had 3 support partners. So we had the Association for Faculty Enrichment in Teaching and Learning, also called AFELT, and they brought curriculum redesign and pedagogical expertise to the partnership. We also had Ashoka East Africa as a partner, and they're the regional hub for the international network of social entrepreneurs and change makers. So they brought expertise to the project in how to work with young people to help them become social entrepreneurs and change makers. And then finally, we had INASP as a project partner. And at INASP, we have over 30 years of experience in supporting universities and their people to strengthen teaching, learning, and research, and to use knowledge to transform lives. So these were the formal project partners that we had within the TESIA partnership. Could we have the next slide, please, Tabitha? So in addition to these formal project partners, we also knew that we needed to bring other key stakeholders into conversations with the partner universities. And we did that because we knew that while many approaches to curriculum development starts with what academics know and what they think that students need to know, we wanted to approach this differently in TESIA. So what we did was to convene students, lecturers, local businesses, employer associations, representatives of the surrounding communities, and national policymakers through what we call joint advisory groups. And what we did when we convened all of these stakeholders was to ask them what skills and competencies our graduates would need. And we also asked them how they could help us to develop better graduates. And this way of convening all of the key stakeholders that we thought needed to be a part of this process is what we have called an ecosystem approach. So essentially trying to include all of the stakeholders that we thought needed to be involved in this process. And this ecosystem approach and convening through the joint advisory groups created opportunities for students to meet employers and discuss their learning, their challenges and expectations. And it also provided opportunities for students to get advice and feedback from the employer perspective. In addition to being involved in the design of curricula, these key stakeholders that we convened through the joint advisory groups were also involved in the delivery of courses. They were involved in this delivery through guest lectures, through student projects and internship placements, and through other practical assignments. Could we have the next slide, please, Tabitha? While we were implementing the TESIA project in the 4 partner universities, our ambition was always to learn from our implementation and collate our learning and resources that we developed so that the project could be scaled to other universities or other higher education learning institutions. And so all of the tools and resources that we've developed during TESIA can be accessed through our website, transformhe.org, and you can see the link on the slide. The tools and resources that we've developed include toolkits and online courses specifically designed to support institutions and lecturers in low resource settings to transform their teaching and learning practices. The resources also include case studies So among others, we have case studies on how we approached designing and putting together these joint advisory groups, so what we're calling our ecosystem approach. And we also have developed case studies on other aspects of the project and how we approach things in the project. So they're available for anyone who might be interested on the transformhe.org website. Today, I'm joined by 3 of my colleagues from the TESIA partnership, and we will be in our conversation to share further insights on how this ecosystem approach was conceptualized and how it works. So I'm going to quickly introduce my colleagues, and then we will move on to the conversation part of this session. So the colleagues that are joining me today are Professor Flora Fabian. Flora has recently become the founding Vice Chancellor of Mwanza University in Tanzania, and until recently she was Professor of Anatomy at the University of Dodoma. And so Flora was the co-lead for the TESIA project at the University of Dodoma. I am also, hopefully, I think we have him here now, joined by Vincent Otieno Odhiambo. He is the regional director for Ashoka East Africa. And Ashoka played an active role in establishing the joint advisory groups in the TESIA project by delivering change maker organization mentality training. And they also recommended fellows from their network who could join the joint advisory groups and provide advice to the universities in terms of what skills students would need when they graduate. Finally, I'm joined by Dr. Kendi Muchungi. She's an instructional designer at the Aga Khan University and a member of the Association for Faculty Enrichment in Teaching and Learning, AFELT. And Kendi was a part of the AFELT team that facilitated transformative learning and course redesign workshops during the TESIA project. Before we move on to the panel session and our conversation, we will now share the results of the questions we asked you at the beginning on Mentimeter. So I think we're all very curious to see what you replied to those questions. So the first question we asked was what skills and competencies do future think tankers need? Among the responses we've gotten from you are critical, reflective observation and thinking, comfort in engaging with ill-structured and ambiguous problems, research, facilitation, digital engagement and data analysis, people skills, looks to failure as an opportunity for growth, partnerships and collaboration skills, digital AI, they will have to engage with and produce algorithms, intercultural competencies, so the ability to function effectively across cultures, to think and act appropriately, to communicate and work with people from different cultural backgrounds at home or abroad. We also asked a second question. So are young people currently learning the skills that future think tankers need? And it looks like most people disagreed with this. So it looks like in the room, we don't really think that young people are currently learning the skills that future think tankers need. So that's interesting and also speaks to the challenge that we identified at the beginning of the TESIA project, which was that graduates can often be ill-prepared to enter into the workplace, and they're not always being equipped with the skills that they actually need during their time at university. So I think that leads us on to our conversation, which we will get started now. So the way we're going to run this session is I will ask some questions of my colleagues, which they will then try to answer, and that will lead us into a discussion. So the first question I would like to ask is for you, Kendi. So building on the responses from the Mentimeter, how can universities help students who might go on to work in think tanks or similar organizations learn how to think and solve problems?
Thanks, Mai. I hope you can all hear me. Yeah, first, really lovely responses on Menti and what the observations or the solutions or the ideas that were shared on Menti brought to mind was the importance of allowing students the responsibility of their own learning. Unfortunately, and I hope this is not too much of a sweeping statement, but culturally, I think we take our degrees or programming in line with what our parents want, a lot of the times in response to the needs within our families. And it's our learning environments have always been very hierarchical, where the teacher knows all, you as a student will just go in there and be told what to think. Whereas through the TESA engagement, some of the things that we were encouraging was to allow autonomy, the students' autonomy of their own learning. But how do we do that? Some of the things that we're thinking we introduced during the project was creating living labs that promoted authentic learning. And what did that look like? I think you alluded to the fact that we invited the community, we invited industry into to help us redesign courses for the project. But beyond that, we then further invited industry and the community within the learning spaces. What did that mean? First, it allowed students to exposure to what is currently going on in industry, and that exposure a lot of the times led to transferable skills. With transferable skills, students then are better able to adapt when they are faced with ill-structured problems, as was mentioned on Menti. And if they're able to recognize that, be comfortable with ill-structured problems, then they can use a critical reflective observation or the critical thinking that was infused throughout the learning by the course redesign to solve for these problems. So, and the idea of introducing industry and the community into the learning spaces also meant that the students were exposed to the world and to the standard that the world is currently having. And this exposure meant that they would not be surprised when they finally went into the world of work. They were already comfortable with the skilling that is required today to meet the demands of the world of work. And doing this iteratively as facilitators of learning, such that we're improving the efficacy of our programming, really will support this idea. Thanks, Mai.
Thank you, Kendi. So thinking more about how to best prepare students for the world of work and what they might go on to do, be that as future think tankers or something else, and the importance of sort of making sure that learning is designed well, and with that in mind, obviously what we did in TESIA was bringing prospective employers and community and other players into those conversations with universities about what types of skills students would need. So I would like to come to you, Vincent, now and ask what needs to happen internally at the university for them to start thinking about an ecosystem approach to teaching and learning, so involving external stakeholders in the teaching and learning process. And what does this mean for faculty and students when external stakeholders are brought into the teaching and learning process?
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Mai. I think so. Leading the work of growing this transformative network of leading social entrepreneurs and change leaders and institutions is thrilling. But I think for the last couple of years, since we started with TESEA, I think the more thrill for me has come from witnessing what we'd consider as the transformative power of higher education institutions, the 4 universities that we worked with, in terms of serving, seeing how they transform towards really serving the real needs of students. Of course, employers through the joint advisory groups, the communities, the immediate communities at large, and in a way positioning themselves as leaders, in the higher education sector. So I think for Bill, looking at that and how they are, creatively building this new framework where, future think tankers have the mindset, from critical thinking to problem solving, and they have the attitude and they have the network. I mean, thinking the network that we were able to bring, as partners to contribute critically, in terms of building new thoughts and new ideas around the different kind of challenges that we're seeing. For me, that has been really thrilling and fulfilling. So to come to your question, I think what we have learned, and this is really infinitely harder to to put any other way. It's really hard to change what already exists, and compared to maybe starting something afresh. So when you're starting from the scratch, if it's a startup, it's really it's easy. But you can imagine for institutions of higher learning, universities like the 4 universities that we're working with, where there is a culture, there are systems, there are processes that have been there for so long. And you want to introduce a totally different dynamic where you're bringing in external stakeholders to now be, key players in almost kind of the day-to-day running or thinking of how the curriculum should look like, and what that means to the students and what does it mean to the employers. So it's a bit of work. However, for Tese, I think what it demonstrated to us was that there is a potential. There's a huge potential for universities when they shift their resources, when they shift their focus. Broadly, whenever there is that kind of a shift within a large traditional, status quo, comfort zone institution, can lead to results at a much larger scale. And so for universities, what we saw in terms of what needs to happen internally before they embrace, in the midst of all these traditional things that they've already been doing, a culture that is set, processes that are set, systems that are set, is a set of questions that we began to ask ourselves with the university, faculty and the project team members, team leads who were there. One was, what are the best practices for how we need to prepare the future think tankers for a world of change? Because I think that is something that we all agreed. It's a world of change, and it's accelerated change, and it's very complex. So what are the best practices that we need to incorporate, that we need to bring into this, while also looking at the realities on the ground, in terms of the very local realities and the local needs. And I see, for me, I would say that was one of the questions, basically. And then, so it meant that for the universities was to look internally to make sure that this shared vision around the need for university to start embracing what is new, what are probably best practices that will not necessarily come from the academia, but will be coming from established social entrepreneurs and other leaders from the broader labor movement. So I would say that question of what needs to happen and framing it and, kind of thinking it around a vision and building a vision around it is critical for universities internally. Then the other question that we kind of asked ourselves was what are the new models for organizing to be more adaptive and relevant to current needs, especially for universities. So what are the current realities? What are the current needs? And what is this inevitable future that we don't even know how it will look like? We don't know how to, what jobs will be there for students to sort of graduate with those kind of skills. We don't know what the future of work will look like. So how do we organize around that? So I think that question sort of enabled the university to think through the systems that are quite hierarchical and siloed, to start thinking world's no more kind of an orientation, right? Meaning being very welcoming to ideas that are coming from outside, and also seeing the critical role that even those external stakeholders will definitely play when it comes to really thinking what would the future look like, what sort of employability skills do they need to have. So I would say internally for the universities, answering this question and beginning to think beyond silos, think beyond departments, think beyond, I'd say schools or even campuses. Then the third question that really helped the universities also, and I'm saying a lot of this was not new for the 4 universities that we worked with. There was already some elements of this, but I think now to say and having this collective approach to it, I think provided the impetus for them to leap from. The third question was, what are the smart incentives that can be leveraged to increase collaboration and innovation within and across disciplines, across universities, across sectors, you name it. So there's a big question of incentive. So incentive here, the 4 universities approached it differently. But I think the fundamental thing was to really think of how to redefine success, both for faculty, for students, so that anything else that is above and beyond what was originally sort of expected within the curriculum is seen as a win, is an incentive. Celebrating that is an incentive. And of course, making problem solving, critical thinking cool, and the thing to have, the skills to have for future think tankers, also sort of incentivize the students so that they would see everything that they were doing as they developed their portfolio, everything counted to something. So I think universities thinking, how do we incentivize this, does help in figuring out what exactly should we put in place. Then finally, I think there was a question of what can we do to pull all the relevant stakeholders to be part of driving the next evolution of needed change in higher education, of course, to graduate more think tankers who are problem solvers, and very critical thinking in terms of building ideas. So I would say that also as a question enabled the universities to figure out what they needed to specifically have in place. So in summary, I would say the issue around, leadership vision has to be there. There has to be a cultivated leadership vision, which is very clear on what we need to see, what is the end result, what is the end game, how are we redefining success. Then there should be a simultaneous engagement from top down, bottom up, and bridging, from the middle. We know when change is being driven from one sector or maybe from one sort of group, it's likely not to be sustainable and may even have negative consequences. So the thinking of how do we bring everyone together, bottom up, top down, bridging from the middle, is something that we observe with a lot of these universities. Some of this were also not thought through within those kind of framework, but we could see this were the building blocks that enabled the success of the project. The world's normal structure, where we are thinking beyond the silos, we're thinking beyond disciplinary silos, we're thinking beyond the rigid hierarchies that universities tend to have. I think that's also something that the universities were able to model, sort of an open, adaptive approach in engaging external stakeholders and also engaging within the universities. And then lastly, and very important, is how do we move, and I think Kendi was just talking about this, how, traditionally teaching experience has been top down, like it's the lecturer, as the holder of knowledge and everything, and the students basically are empty containers to be filled. I think what we've seen is that students must be placed as co-creators or collaborators. So if we have to move away from, that traditional setup where, classrooms were basically, or lecture rooms were set up in ways that reinforces the industrial age thinking, the industrial age way of doing things. So we saw in the universities a move away from that and getting students to be at the center of the conversation from the word go, not like late entrance. So I'd say those are some of the things that we saw universities align, the 4 universities, but they were all anchored around 5 major questions of what really needs to happen, going forward.
Thank you, Vincent. So I want to come back to you quickly, Kendi. So building on from what Vincent has said about sort of universities redefining what success looks like and being open to conversations with external stakeholders and bringing them in to sort of the teaching and learning process and what needs to happen through that. I know we've already sort of mentioned some of these, but who are the key stakeholders that universities need to involve in transforming teaching and learning? And how can these stakeholders be identified?
Great question, Mai, and thanks, Vincent, for that exposition. Really, I think just from lessons learned, the key thing that needed to happen was to carry out a situational analysis, because program to program, institution to institution, depending on their workflows, the kind of stakeholders that needed to be invited to the table to inform the redesigning of the courses such that they promoted critical thinking and problem solving and gender responsiveness had to be identified by each institution, and there was no one mold fits all. So we started off by doing a situational analysis, and this situational analysis was quickly able to showcase the fact that even when we talk about, say, industry, what really do we mean? Is it just the people that are solving problems or that are providing solutions within our communities, or does that extend to policymakers? Does this extend to regulators for the education system? Does this extend to prospective employers who might not be very comfortable with a student that is thinking autonomously and is questioning the status quo? And so I think iteratively we were able to identify different and unique stakeholders to bring to the table, but clearly, and what was most important was that our students were one of the key stakeholders to ensure that they were on the table, so that they would understand things were changing in terms of how learning was going to happen, and the reason why they were changing is so that it was for their benefit, as opposed to it just being a new thing that was being imposed on them, but so that we could get the necessary buy-in. Another critical aspect was to ensure that top management, there was buy-in from top management, such that when there was proposition of new ways of facilitating learning, of new ways of engaging with students, there was immediate buy-in, and there was going to be a systemic approach, as opposed to individual faculty who had attended our programming having to face that hurdle on their own. Yeah, thanks, Mai.
Thank you, Candy. So we've spent some time now, obviously, talking about the ecosystem approach and talking about the joint advisory groups, and sort of how this worked in TESIA. I would like to come to you now, Flora. So from a perspective of a university, obviously there was a partner in TESIA and where TESIA was implemented. How did the joint advisory groups work in TESIA and at the University of Dodoma? And what, from your perspective, has been the biggest contribution of the joint advisory groups in terms of preparing students for the world of work?
Thank you, Mai, and everyone. Just to start with, I will follow up from where Candy was just talking about it. The joint advisory groups consisted of those which we called internal partners. And as she mentioned, students were part of the internal partners with lecturers, management, and actually up to top management consisted the internal partners in the JAG. And we had external partners, which we actually involved private, public employers, industry, policymakers, regulators, specifically the Ministry of Education themselves. But also we had NGOs, we had innovators, we even had community participants. And really a key factor here was openness. As we all know, traditionally universities are used to making their own decisions as long as they follow what the regulators want, and they will prepare their curricula assuming what the future think tanker or what the future employee is going to need. But here we had consultations, and this openness, and actually universities humbling themselves to listen to the external partners, to listen to the students, and the regulators coming on board and actually learning on our ecosystem and the pedagogies of critical thinking, problem solving, and gender responsiveness. And this was really a strong factor here. And as these regulators and policymakers were involved and brought into the conversation, the students felt respected, and they felt that their needs are being considered. And they really participated fully from what they are actually going to learn and how they are going to learn. And therefore, during the course redesign, where we were looking at the courses and seeing whether those skills which were being considered by the external partners as actually future employees or current spaces where the think tankers can work were being considered, and students took full responsibility of bringing in their opinion and what they feel they would need to do to actually change the community around and participate in the development of the community and themselves. So traditionally, we know that when the students graduate, they just go out there and start looking for work. But during this time, the JAGs were able to have a program of students and lecturers as facilitators visiting the workplace with the students, a program we call the internship. We know traditionally internships have been there, but they have been kind of this disconnect between the facilitators and the students and the university management, and of course the employer where the students were doing the internship. But this time, we all worked as partners, and we really made sure that the lecturers as facilitators were aware on what the employer requires practically. And therefore, these internships were really beneficial to the students. And the universities at the end reconsidered on the approach of their curriculum review and curricular development by bringing in the employers, not only as people who are bringing ideas, but in our curricular revision. And of course, they were partners also in actively redesigning the courses. And as mentioned by both Vincent and Kendi, there was this transformative learning where we used the flipped classroom, where the student was at the center and the students participated actively in the learning process. So students, from there, students started forming their own clubs, which we call the students' clubs. They were able to actually form innovative and project development clubs where they involved the community around. And therefore, we considered them as actually current think tankers within the university. And of course, they also participated with the external partners who formed the JAGs as mentors. So they were also being mentored to become entrepreneurs, to become policymakers, and of course, gender clubs, where issues of gender, so that the curricula can actually consider on the special needs, the needs of both gender, and how the teaching and learning space should consider both. And really, the impacts there is the transformation of the students themselves, transformation of the facilitators, and most importantly, transformation of the university management and systems up to policy reviews to actually include how learning should be effective and how the teaching spaces should be innovative so that it brings every learner on board. Basically, that is what I would say my.
Thank you, Flora. So you mentioned sort of the openness and willingness of the university to really listen and learn from the external stakeholders and engage with them. So obviously that's sort of seems to come out in what all three of you have said as a key criteria for a successful partnership between universities, social entrepreneurs, businesses, policymakers, the communities, whoever might be brought into these conversations. I would like to come back to you, Vincent, because you obviously helped to sort of shape these joint advisory groups, or Ashoka East Africa did, and set them up at the universities. Sort of very briefly, are there any other sort of key criteria that makes for a successful partnership between universities and their external stakeholders from your experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Mike. So I kind of listened into the opening session of this conference and also the keynote, and it's all around partnership and how do we move, I think the whole idea of think tankers to change hubs. And so for me, looking at what we achieved with TESEA looking broadly within the partnership and also with the external stakeholders, there are quite a number of key sort of lessons in terms of how do we narrow down to partners and how do we successfully work around that. And this can be applied across, I believe, and some of this also, John from INAS also has articulated. There's a blog, he wrote around this, which kind of mirrors a lot what we saw as a partnership and also in structuring these linkages with external stakeholders for universities. So I think the first thing is basically cultivating shared leadership. So looking at vision alignment, so to speak, the whole idea of employability is a big deal. The whole idea of future think tankers who are problem solvers and critical thinkers is a big deal. And this is something that internally for the university is a shared vision, and also externally you find people who are articulating the same, maybe in their own different kind of wording, their own way of messaging it, but there is that sort of shared vision, which then makes it very easy for partnership to cultivate shared leadership. And so shared leadership is very important here because, we so often talked about this. It's all in the partnership. So the process of identifying who is the right person to bring on board and how do you structure, that particular partnership has to be shared across. The leadership for that process has to be shared across, so that everyone or every institution that is part of that feels they have the leeway in terms of making suggestions, or rather they have a voice to be had. Then the second thing I think is just capacity. So in terms of even with that opening keynote, I think there was an issue of partnerships that had to craft. For these external players, education and providing for education is not their key, main thing. They're into the different kind of business, some social impacts, some, trying to make profit out there for their shareholders. So getting a university also where you have faculty that are focused in a certain way already there are issues to do with the resources, there are issues to do with resources in whatever way, funds and time, and people need to make this kind of commitments. So how do you capacitate the partnership to have what it takes to do this? What sort of engagement framework do you develop for the partners to thrive within that kind of a setup? So I think for the connection between the universities and the external stakeholders, the joint advisory group, there was consensus around when are you available, how often should we be meeting, what are some of the deliverables? So that's in a way helped to build the capacity around what was supposed to be delivered. So I think also the third thing is the level of commitment to feedback. There is a lot to learn from the universities, and there's a lot for universities to learn from external partners. And of course, there's also a lot to learn from students who previously have not been engaged as much, right? So there is the need to commit to feedback, both in terms of giving and in terms of receiving. And this is something that we've seen also play a lot, within the data set partnership. Then the ability for the partnership to condition as a way, as a culture, decision making. It's important to make decisions. So kind of looking at everyone has the space to authentically, make decisions. So authentic role in decision making, so to speak. There are clear principles that gets to guide this. Partners should also always come into these conversations asking themselves, are we the best people to make this decision on behalf of the university, or are we the right people to make this decision on behalf of students, And then also seeking input from all the stakeholders that are involved. There was that as a very intentional mechanism of operating from the word go, always seeking to get input from all the stakeholders that had been identified to be critical on this. So whether in terms of availability, there was a bit of challenge, but trying to get input has been from all of those different stakeholders. Then also the ability to create a common understanding. Okay, so the need, like I said, the need was real, the need was recognized both internally and externally. There's a lot of research that show future think tankers must be people of certain way of thinking, must have certain way of thinking. And of course, to support these, future think tankers who are now university students, we need to build an ecosystem around them. And so the ecosystem approach, and also we need to have a network around them. So to get that, there has to be a common understanding. So I think identifying the need to improve, on employability and to have these kind of skills was that common understanding. So I'd say that is also another characteristic or criteria or principle that should be applied. And we did apply in effectively, running the linkages and the bridging between the joint advisory group, other stakeholders, external stakeholders, and the universities within the program itself, but also broadly, I think, within the university, across the universities, just having that, ability to co-create a common understanding.
Thank you, Vincent. So I want to make sure that we have time to address any questions that the audience may have. So if you have any questions, please type them in in the chat, and then we'll pick them up very shortly. Before we move on to answering any questions, I know you've already talked about this, Flora, but I wonder if you could again sort of just very briefly outline for us what the ecosystem approach that we took in TESIA meant for students at the University of Dodoma, particularly with a view to them potentially going on to becoming future think tankers or other types of employment where they might need some of these skills we've been talking about.
Thank you, Mai. I think the most important change that occurred in the students is the change of attitude. Traditionally, students were passive learners, and they will just learn and reproduce, and they get the certificate and they go. But the ecosystem approach, where students felt they were actually respected, their needs were considered, and they were partners in the learning. This changed their attitude, and they became active partners in their own learning. instead of just being recipients of knowledge. And through the transformative learning, these students developed the skills that were actually intended, which is critical thinking, problem-solving skills, but most importantly, gender responsive. They oriented themselves in solving the society problems. So the clubs that they developed, they actually involved the communities around, and therefore they already started the journey to become think tankers. And these students, as we mentioned, they developed and formed these different clubs, and these clubs were very positively received by the communities around, and they contributed in the socio-economical change of the community. And therefore, these students, we don't say they are actually just future think tankers, but they already demonstrated their abilities to become think tankers and act as one. And these are going to influence policymakers, regulators, and of course, future good higher education learning. So I would say the lessons learned from this ecosystem is that building ecosystem is key in actually embedding systemic change in higher education, where we had management, students, lecturers as facilitators, as partners with the external members to actually change the way our higher education system operates. And the student-centered learning, or the flipped classroom, actually made students active partners in their own learning. And this was a key factor in bringing out their critical thinking and problem-solving skills. And therefore, it enabled them to form think tanks within the universities, where they had innovation clubs, economic clubs, and so forth. And of course, to become future think tankers. And finally, not least, lecturers became facilitators, and they became the agents of change for the students to develop their abilities to become think tankers. So in summary, that's why I would say mine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Flora. I don't see any questions as such in the chat, but I see a number of comments, and I think, Kendi, you've already sort of replied to some of them as we've been going. I wonder if there's sort of any of the comments you've been replying to in particular that you would like to pick up on, Kendi, and maybe expand upon a bit?
Sure, thanks. I think one of the questions or comments, I think it was a question actually, came from Katrina, who was asking, well, how come I'm not seeing the question now? Yeah, she was talking about, oh, there, I find it. I think, anyway, she was talking about LMI, so low and middle income economies or communities, and how did this idea of the TESIA project, transforming employability for social change, work in these communities. And maybe my response was more in terms of our approach, because we didn't like introduce resources per se, but we introduced a change in thinking, as Prof so rightly put it. So when we engaged with facilitators to the point that they could see learning happening differently, when there was exposure of facilitators to industry and the community, and them introducing those activities or problems within community and industry into their learning spaces, it changed the attitudes, or the attitudes of mind of both the facilitator and the students. And what that meant was that facilitators became more creative in terms of the kind of learning they were introducing for their students. A case in point, several teachers would go to, say, a setting where all their students could not fit but use a phone, which was accessible to all students, to connect their students with industry, maybe in learning something unique or engaging with something unique from industry or the community, and multiple other ideas like this. I think it was critical, that change in mind, change in attitude as to what transformative learning looks like. It's learning that transforms the individual to the point that they're able to better observe their communities and also solve for their communities' problems. So I think that was my general response. But maybe also to add on to what Vincent and Prof have been talking about in terms of the implications of the ecosystem and how the ecosystem thrived. The key thing, I think, and Vincent alluded to it, was the fact that there was room for failure and iteration. I think there was a lot of learning. I remember our first ever kick at the can of the project was very interesting, but it allowed a lot of learning such that we were able to iterate and improve the process. And I think that for us meant that that could be replicated by the facilitators. It meant that they understood that failure really is not the end of it all, but it's actually the beginning. It gives you an opportunity, another opportunity to look at something differently with a different lens. Also the aspect of managing expectations, I think, was critical, so that nobody expected like a magic wand, but it was sustained small steps towards our ultimate goal. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you, Flora and Vincent, if you want to come in on this and expand on that. But while you do so, we have a final question that we would like to ask of the audience. So I was thinking we could do those simultaneously, because we've obviously been talking about sort of the key stakeholders that we think needs to be involved in this ecosystem approach. But we would very much like to hear from the audience who you think are the key stakeholders and which are the most important stakeholders to include in conversations with universities about the skills and competencies that future graduates need. So there's another link to Menti in the chat box. So if you could follow that, we would appreciate your input through that, and then we'll share that with you shortly. Flora, did you want to comment on what Kendi was saying? Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to add a bit on what Kendi was saying. Kendi was speaking about no failures or successes as we wait. It was really a learning process. And this was noticed to the students as well. You know, with the students is always whether you pass or fail. But with the ecosystem approach, and where the transformative learning was happening, students were more on hands-on. And therefore, you have students who are really theoretically very, very good, and those who are practically really very, very good. And these two components actually, build on each other. And therefore, you find students, even those who are maybe theoretically not very good, performing well, because they were allowed to bring in their skills, their critical thinking and problem-solving skills, which will normally do not appear in purely theoretical kind of assessments. And therefore, the assessment styles, which consider the transformative approach and allowing the students to actually bring up their best in critical thinking and how they would solve the problems. It helped students performing well and bringing out their confidence. And this was really something which came out on the side of students. Every student felt they can do something and they can actually be useful, not only within the institution, but in the community.
Thank you, Flora. So I think we've come to the end of this session, but if we could just quickly pull up the results from the Mentimeter so that we could see those, and then we'll close the session down. So it seems like the sort of stakeholder with the greatest responsibility for ensuring that students acquire the skills that they need are the students themselves. And then sort of tied on second and third, I think, are public industry employers and university faculty. Fourth is the community. Fifth is the private industry and employers. Thank you very much for participating in this session, and thank you very much to Flora, Vincent, and Candy for joining me.